Okay, when we think about difficult people, there's just several different approaches we can take. One is to look at our relationship with them, how we see them, look at the expectations we have built into that relationship, and whether the situation is something we can control or not control. And then also the approach of everyone wishing to be happy. Everyone has the same desire, just like us, to be happy, not suffer. So these difficult people may have a different set of ideologies, different set of habits, ways of seeing things, perspectives. But equally, just like us, they have every right to be happy. And maybe in their own way, that's what they're seeking. So let's look a little bit at these different ways from a Buddhist perspective. So there's a whole basis of teachings on emptiness, which independent origination, karma, that which appears to us, and how we define that and how we label it and how we see it is different than the way it actually exists, and that includes other people. And so what we try to do in this kind of, on the basis of this, is try to understand that the relationship we have with people is not so fixed out there, separate from us, but actually has everything to do with us ourselves. It's how we see them, our habits that we have over time developed in the way in which we see them. Because if people existed out there separately in this way, so concretely, then everyone would have to see them in the same way. And we know that's not logically, that's not true. Not everyone has the same kind of way of seeing these other beings. So we have to look at what it is in our own relationship with these people that determine how we see them. And we have to own that. And that has come from a lot of our own history. Buddhists would say not just this life, but other lives as well. But just even within this own life, we have a lot of cultural conditioning. The newspapers we read, the families we come from, the schools we went to, things like this, that just culturally condition us to have a certain perspective. So when we come in contact with a certain type of person, we immediately, either we like them, dislike them, or we don't care. So these are basically very simple ways in which these things arise. Yet they appear to be much more complex than that, but in some ways it really comes down to that. On the basis of our cultural conditioning, we see people on the street, and either we like, or we make some sort of judgment very quickly. And we have to learn to recognize that that's what we're doing. Because that has to do with how we shape the basis of our relationships with these people. So when we see someone fat, skinny, black, white, tall, short, young, old, we immediately form some kind of judgment within our own minds. And that we have to recognize where that's coming from. It's us. It doesn't mean that that person doesn't have anything from our side. It's just that we have to recognize our role in that determination. So sometimes with these difficult people, it's really, a lot has to do with how we're seeing them and the expectations we place on these kind of people. It doesn't mean from their side they're not doing anything. We will address address that. But it does mean that we have to acknowledge our role in that. Is this clear? Following this? Questions? Oh yeah, there are difficult people. They're definitely difficult. We'll address that as well. There are difficult people. But we have to at least acknowledge how our mind is working. When it comes into contact with another individual, it could be an animal as well, it immediately forms some kind of judgment. It's either aversion or attachment coming into place, or it's very neutral. Recognize that part, and begin the process really of dealing with difficult people. Okay. The other aspect that we touched upon is this: when we recognize that this. We're also seeing people in a certain way. We also recognize that that way we're seeing them also is subject to change. It's momentary. It doesn't last. It's not permanent. So somebody we didn't even know in the past is now our best friend. And someone who was our friend who's hurt us is now our enemy. So that the basis of these relationships we have with people are they do change. If they were so fixed, difficult people out there, if it was fixed and that's the only way they are, then it would be impossible to change, but they do change. Everyone has a possibility of change. Not only do we change in our relationship with them, but they also change in their relationship to us. And so there's great potential in that. It's not always easy, and it's not overnight, but there is a possibility of change. So first acknowledging our own part of it, and then acknowledging the fact that it can change. The third part is acknowledging what we can control and what we can't control in terms of knowing that we have this perspective on these people, knowing how we relate to them, knowing our relationship, working relationship, what other family relationship, then you look at the aspects of them, and you also look at which parts of it can you control and which parts of it you can't. It's kind of like, why beat yourself up if it is their issue and you have nothing to do to, you can't, it's not in your power to change it. If they have, and one of the things is to really recognize that they also are coming from this place of wishing to be happy, not wanting to suffer, just like we are. And everything we do, from the foods we eat, from the friends we make, from the activities we engage in, is this constant desire to be happy and free of suffering. That's the motivating factor behind all of our actions. All of our thoughts, actually, moment by moment, is this desire to be happy. They're no different. And the one thing to recognize is that in some ways, they are just a creature of habit as well, in the way in which they relate to what makes them happy and what doesn't. And nobody's saying that they're necessarily correct in what they engage in terms of wishing to be happy. But what we are saying is that sometimes it's not about you, it's about them. And there's nothing you can do about it in terms of changing them. They may not like you for whatever reason, but it's not necessarily about you at all. And you may not be able to change that. What can you do? What can you change? What you can change is your expectation. your expectation that they need to like you, your expectation that they will like you, the expectation. That's what you have control over. You don't have control over how they see you. It's important to reflect on that. In my own experience, I remember working with someone for years, and I couldn't understand. There was always this frequency of remarks being made in our working relationship, putting me down, wanting to be in control, and in times when I wasn't really, not that I haven't ever tried to be in control or anything like that, but in these different situations, and it took me for years. I'd be hurt by these actions. It took me a long time to come to the realization it had nothing to do with me. It had more to do with this person's background, growing up with brothers and probably having some kind of similar kind of relationship with me, where she was feeling like I was the older brother trying to tell her what to do. So there would be all these kind of situations where it just would reflect back, and it had nothing to do. It wasn't about me. It was about her own history, her own habits, her own way of seeing things, her own perspectives. And as soon as I acknowledged that, it was fine. As soon as I acknowledged that, it was fine. It doesn't mean it just stopped happening. But I also, it definitely got less, because I wasn't buying into it so much, making it mine. And I wasn't having an expectation that it would be different. But, they have their story. They're working, they have to work on themselves, and maybe they will and maybe they won't. You have to really clearly know what they can and cannot do from their side. And if you can skillfully, if you have the wisdom sometimes, you can shift things. There are great stories of lamas, talking about, there's one story, I guess, that Ravina gives in Australia. These two neighbors, they hated each other. The one neighbor used to just never got along with them. Kind of would scratch the keys into the car and things like this, really, really rude. And so finally, he asked the Lama, and the Lama says, well, see him as your best friend. See him as your best friend. And so he ended up, the story was he ended up giving him golf balls, coming over there, buying a present of golf balls, and taking it over and making this offering. And the person completely, completely transformed just from that simple act of kindness. I've also found in my own relationship, certainly in this day and age of communications with emails, where we have all these kind of conversations that are very one-sided, where you're giving information. Emails are very, very good and effective sharing information in some ways, but they also have their downside in the fact that it's always a one-sided conversation. So there's one side where you're interpreting what the other person is, how they're going to receive this, and then they receive it and they're interpreting it the way they think you're meaning it. And sometimes those two don't match. And I found that sometimes going back and forth, especially with emails that start to go back and forth, that it's much more beneficial for me to pick up a phone and talk to them in person and relate to them in that way. Because there's not so much projection being made on these words, which we're not always so careful about the way we say things, or we're just in a hurry, or we're not thinking, reflecting, and then they're coming from a completely different reality over from their perspective. So sometimes, and I found even now where where there are difficult situations sometimes with people at a distance, human contact is so important. Sitting down with someone face to face, it brings that back down to that very human level, where you understand that the person who's there with you also wants to be happy. So your own projections about them, you see them as a human being, not as some kind of built-up image, in your mind of who this person is. And we come from a culture where we tend to do that a lot. I mean, if you just look at the campaigns, we've never met McCain or Obama. I mean, at least I haven't in person, but I have all these kind of views built up. But I know that if I'm in the same room with them, I'm going to see them as human beings. As human beings, wishing to be happy, and as human beings. And I'm not necessarily going to elevate one over the other in terms of that. It's kind of interesting because historically, I've been fairly lucky about this. Because I've been around some very interesting, shall we say, there have been experiences of mine where I've been around some very influential or well-recognized famous figures where I've really related to them as human beings first, more than as these kind of public or famous figures. And it has really made it much more comfortable for me, as well as I think for them in some ways. Because in some ways, that is what it's about, as being human. So looking at things in which you can and cannot change them, and looking how your own mind has to do with how you're seeing it, and from their side too, how they're looking at things, okay? And then working with those expectations we have, especially when it's not in your control. I mean, historically, most of my suffering comes from my attachment to certain expectations, expecting people to be in a certain way, expect them to do things in a certain way, expecting to understand what they're supposed to understand without necessarily having the capacity or to understand. Always it's my expectations. A lot of them I'm very attached to. It's like, it's very clear to me. Oh, it's as simple as ABC. You just do it this way, and But they are coming from their side, and it is my view again, and it is my expectation. I'm not taking into account their feelings, their ways of seeing things, their own habits and histories and cultural identity and things like that. I'm just assuming everyone sees the world in the same way I do. So I have these expectations, and it's learning to understand that this is what I have power over. And there are some situations where I have my way of doing things, and I'm not saying that I'm wrong. In fact, I'm very, very clear that this is not how I would approach this. But I'm not in a situation where I'm given the authority or power to change those things. I'm just in a situation where I am, in fact, part of a group where I don't have the authority. So rather than getting frustrated and irritated, what can I do? I can change my expectations. And I can also, and this has been very, very, my teacher Geshe-la here, he's been amazingly, because no matter, he's so solid and stable, and no matter what comes along, he has compassion, kindness, and he just sees it, and he's when people suffer, and he sees how we do things, we create our own suffering. But he's also he knows that within himself he's very content. And so no matter what comes along, his mind is undisturbed. And this is his example, and I'm so fortunate because I have such, contact with him on a daily basis to see this and, how it's in place. But how it's been, when I apply these same kind of principles, my own life really changes. Because I'm not creating these expectations in situations where I don't have control, then I have to let go and let the situation. And I may see things, I still have wisdom, but I'm not the one that's in control here. And I need to then look at, this situation may have certain results that if I had done it my way, it wouldn't have those results. But, hey, I'm not in control, so those aren't my results.